Thank you very much. Actually, the first is an official announcement. Currently, the institute that I work for is called the John Lukács Institute for Politics and Strategy. This is kind of the same framework, but with some modifications in the past 2 months, so just for the official affiliation. It is an honor and pleasure to be here, and of course a pleasure to be part of the project. And my presentation will focus on a slightly different angle, or I would say give an overview at a different level, because I'm going to speak about the trends and drivers of European defense industrial cooperation in the 2020s, which means that I'm not focusing on a legal topic, and I'm not going to dig deep into one very specific issue, but I'm going to speak about long-term trends of defense and defense policy. Maybe this is most similar to what Professor Anna Molnár was talking about in the morning session. So in my brief presentation, I'm going to speak about 4 things. The first is giving an overview of those strategic obstacles and enablers that drive defense cooperation and defense industrial cooperation forward in Europe. Then I will touch upon the demand problem, or the demand side of defense industrial cooperation, and on the supply side as well, because the two should ideally meet at one point. And then kind of going towards the conclusions, I will have a snapshot of what the European Defense Industrial Strategy offers for us for the 2020s. Luckily, this strategy has just been published by the European Commission and other institutions this week, so we have something very new, topical, and tangible to speak about. And I will offer a couple of suggestions for conclusion. So to start with, what are the things that drive European defense industrial cooperation forward? If I were to put it in one sentence, then this is the 30 years of peace Europe has enjoyed in the past 3 decades, or about 3 decades, because European countries kind of forgot how to wage a war, how to prepare for a war, and how to run defense industry that is able to support militaries able to fight a war. And to start with, we can name the first element, the so-called peace dividend. After the end of the Cold War, European militaries transformed. The large-scale militaries, mass armies were downsized, which also meant, on the one hand, downsizing manpower, on the other hand, downsizing equipment and structures as well. This was positive because the security environment was favorable. There was no risk of large-scale war between great powers on European territory, and the people in general were happy to use the funds previously spent for defense for some other purposes. That's why we call it the peace dividend, because the peaceful situation in Europe made it possible to use these funds not spent on defense to be spent on some other issues, and these were mostly social expenses. So people were very much happy about this. But this also meant that a process started that lasted for more than 20 years, when European armed forces were underfinanced. For a while, it was justified by the fact that we are not preparing for the war, but after the turn of millennium, European military started to engage more and more in peacekeeping operations, stabilization operations. Just remember Afghanistan, 20 years, Iraq, 8 years, and so on, and sustained presence in the Balkans. And this underfinancing became more and more of a problem for European militaries, because they did not modernize and they did not cover the costs for maintaining modern armed forces. So after the turn of millennium, we can speak about what we call residual financing, which is if you have your state budget and you cover all other more important aspects, then what is left you can spend on defense. So this was kind of the last resort of spending. Defense was not prioritized for, again, 15 to 20 years. Now we have seen, after that, strategic turning points. One of them was 2008 and 9, because of the global financial and economic crisis. The second one was 2014, Russia's first aggression against Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the destabilization of the Donbass. And the third one was clearly 2022. And these events, particularly 2014 and 2022, pushed European countries to pay more attention to defense and to start again developing their armed forces. But this kind of surprised European countries as a strategic shock, repeatedly because they were preparing since the turn of millennium for peacekeeping operations. They were active, just as I mentioned, in neighboring regions. And this has changed not just the operational profile of European armed forces, but also the capabilities they possessed. More and more growing capability gaps had been identified repeatedly by the European Union and by NATO as well. And usually they pointed out that European armed forces have very limited capabilities to act on their own. Without the support of the United States, European countries were not able to finish the Libya intervention, and they were not able to evacuate from Afghanistan. And the two operations took place 10 years apart. So it seemed that European countries didn't really learn the lessons that something should be changed in terms of defense and in terms of defense industry. One of the key problems, of course, is that defense as a policy sphere and as a strategic sphere of activities of European countries has remained fragmented because CSDP is mostly intergovernmental in nature, which means that responsibilities, just as money, lays at the member states in national capitals. So if national capitals don't want to spend on defense, if they don't want to boost their defense spending and their defense industry, then nothing is going to change just because the European Union adopts one or another new framework or institutional initiative. Last but not least, I would quote as an obstacle the very strong US presence and US role in European defense, deterrence, defense, and operational capabilities, as well as the very significant ratio of US weapons, US arms and weapons provided for European countries that were easy to buy off the shelf, but meant a very strong obstacle when in parallel European countries wanted to develop their own defense industries, because the US was usually moving forward at a greater pace. In many areas was more modern than European armed forces and European defense industry, and has enjoyed a competitive edge. And we are still in this situation. So these are the bad news. What is the good news? Well, there are some enablers. At the same time, these are stress factors that make us think more about defense and defense industrial development. The security environment has changed. The bad news is that it has changed for the worse. So defense has come more to the forefront. European countries, especially since 2022, have been focusing more on traditional, conventional military capabilities and boosting their armed forces and their defense industrial capabilities and production capabilities. This means that military defense is back on the table. Everyone's more or less interested in it. Capitals, so member states of the European Union are willing to spend on defense in a more increased manner. At the same time, this means that there is an identifiable, visible military direct threat. Most European countries fear, and this is Russia. And this means this changed threat perception that European countries are set on a course to prepare for a possibility of great power war within Europe. And this requires the very significant retransformation and reconfiguration, as well as development of European defense industry and the European defense industrial and technological base. And there is a second factor that drives this effort forward. This is the immediate need to support Ukraine in its form of self-defense. So if you can see, maybe, the figure, this is called the dual spiral of diminishing capabilities. And on the left side is the economic field. The process started, just as I mentioned, in 2008 and 2009 with the great financial and economic crisis, lacking resources. That's the core idea. And lacking resources led to lower levels of international action, less military activities, less exercises, less modernization programs, also less orders for defense industry. So on the one hand, because of the unfavorable economic background, European countries were not spending on defense industry and defense procurement. On the right side, you can see the political field, in which again the drivers meant that European countries, particularly after 2008 and 2009, were not focusing, and the people living in Europe were not focusing on military issues. They were focusing on social issues, unemployment, social benefits, and so on. There was no tangible, visible military threat that they would have, wanted to spend money on. And this non-military threat perception meant that people and the political elite, of course, were not very much paying attention to modernizing the military. And again, this led to lower levels of international ambition, less involvement in crisis management, and so on. We have seen, or you have seen as well, the past, let's say, 10 years with diminishing European capabilities and direct involvement in the European, let's say, southern neighborhood, leaving countries on their own to tackle their problems on their own. So these two spirals, in parallel, acting in parallel, throughout the 2010s, resulted in the degradation of European defense industry. Just to give you concrete ideas, here you can see the defense spending trends. The data is from European Defense Agency. The trend is between 2005 and 2022. The green line is the actual defense spending of European Union member states together. And the blue dotted line shows how much it would be, or would have been, had they spent 2% of their GDP, which is a NATO requirement, on defense. And you can see the substantial difference. So that was the underspending, the underfinancing of European armed forces. And of course, to a significant extent, the underfinancing of European defense industry. More precisely, if you take a look at defense investment trends, which is procurement plus infrastructure development, again, you can see the green line, which is the actual defense investment cost spent by European Union countries between 2005 and 2022. And you can see the blue dotted line. That would be the 20% defense investment expectation. So from the total defense budget, 20% should have been spent on defense investment, procurements, and so on. That's the modernization budget, let's call it that. Most of the time, it was, again, underspending. And the point I want to make is, and that is important to see, that if you compare the 2009 level, the same level was reached in actual spending only in 2018, 2019. That's the lost decade of European defense when modernization was not funded by European countries. Now, going more to the core of the problem, what do we need to tackle now in 2024? Well, there is a demand problem, which has two parts. The first is what we can call the temporal challenge. Because of the war going on in Ukraine, and because of the changed security environment, the perception that there is a threat emanating in the European neighborhood, there is an immediate need to provide weapons for Ukraine as long as the war lasts, according to most European countries. On the other hand, there is a mid to long-term goal that modernization and procurement that is decided today will only be realized in a 10 to 15 year time scale. Because if I make the decision today, even if I have the resources, I need to pick what system I want to buy, who is going to produce it. It takes time to have it produced. I need to provide for logistics. I need to train the personnel, and I need to start using the given weapon system. It takes 10 to 15 years. So if European countries were to take very definite measures today to ramp up their military production, this is something that they've been doing in the past 2 years, it would yield significant results only by the 2030s. If it's a moderate level, slow process as it has been in the past couple of years. And of course, these immediate needs focus on very specific issues, exemplified by the artillery ammunition that is required by Ukraine in a very short notice in a very large amount. That's European Union member states are unable, and even the United States is unable to cover this need. Therefore, everyone's scouting the world for other options and buying off the shelf from third countries. This is something that does not really help European defense industry. On the other hand, the mid to long-term need means that, okay, we want to make procurements for the long term, but again, European defense industries, all the companies have very limited production capacity. If Poland wants to buy 1,000 tanks, if Hungary wants to buy 44 tanks, then it takes considerable amount of time to have these produced. And if everyone wants to buy tanks, so not just 2 countries, but 15 countries wants to buy the same kind of tanks, then it will take decades to produce them with the current production capacity. Therefore, on the one hand, European countries are expanding their capacities. On the other hand, out of sheer necessity, they are buying from third countries, from outside of the European Union, off the shelf. Again, this is not financing and not supporting the European defense industry and technological base. The other problem on the demand side is the question of what to buy, what to procure, what kind of modernization do we want. It depends on the strategic ambition. European Union luckily has the European Global Strategy, Strategic Compass, and so on, with operational plans in place. So it gives us an idea what the European Union wants to plan for. But again, here is one very definite effect of the Russo-Ukraine war. Most countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, are focusing on territorial defense, on heavy equipment, and so on. That would make possible a homeland defense war. Would make it possible. Other countries are focusing on other issues. The United Kingdom and France, some of the Mediterranean countries are more focusing on naval operations because trade in the Red Sea region has been undermined by Houthi rebels. It doesn't require any tanks to provide free access to sea lanes. It takes warships to keep these channels open. So European countries have different approaches. And even if European countries have some kind of joint vision, what kind of armed forces do they want, still there are questions. Okay, which branches to prioritize? Should it be first the land forces, the space forces, the air force, and so on? Again, what services? Special operation forces or artillery and so on. And then the very specific capability gaps. Again, luckily, in 2022, the European Union conducted a capability gap analysis. But the problem is that these analyses, both in the 2022 gap analysis and in the 2020 and 2022 CARD reviews, revealed 55 to 60 gaps, which is, quite a lot, and very different kinds of gaps. So European countries are not able to cover all these gaps at the same time or in a very short period of time. What's the other side of the equation? The supply problem. So who is going to produce all the arms and how is it possible to develop the European defense industry and technological base? Well, one problem is fragmentation. So many countries have national champions, at least those who have, and they are favoring these national champions, the national companies, when they procure, when they start research and development, then procurement, and production and procurement of the arms. This national fragmentation, again, does not really help or trigger European-level defense cooperation and defense industrial cooperation. There are some tier ones, so the most developed multinational companies, and we have in the European defense industrial technological base about 2,500 small and middle enterprises. But coming up with some major framework that would, make everyone part of this story, and to give a little bit of slice of the cake to each and every country, that's quite challenging. One more problem on the supply side is that, of course, arms industry is interested in having big value and long-term contracts. Let's get a 10 billion euro contract for 15 years for artillery ammunition production. That would be nice, from their side. From the demand side, the problem is that a single European country is not able to provide that much money for one single procurement contract. That's why putting European needs together and cooperating with many countries in joint procurements seems to be a legitimate solution. But the question is how to provide money beyond 2027, because current estimates and promises on behalf of European countries usually end by 2025. European Union funding frameworks will end in 2027 under the current 7-year multi-annual financial framework. What's going to happen after 2027? And the outcome of the Ukraine war will have a very definite effect on this prospect. A third problem on the supply side is how to provide for the necessary raw materials, the supply chain, the workforce, and so on. This is the normal logistical problem of any production process. And once European countries are more and more interested in having joint answers to this question, it becomes more complicated. Favoring one national company and the usual working supply route and the production chain is much easier than harmonizing 10 or 15 countries' various kinds of production facilities. The next problem on the supply side is how to counter the risks and deficiencies of multinational defense cooperation. It is widely known and has been well documented that cost overruns and time overruns are the very common feature of multinational projects, even up to 60–70% of cost overruns and 2 to 3 times time overruns. This is a very tricky issue once countries start to cooperate. On the other hand, it seems that in many cases there is no other option than doing it jointly. And last but not least, a question still, I would say, unanswered because European countries don't agree on it, how to outcompete external actors, particularly the United States, who have a defense industrial edge and they are comparatively in advantage in many sectors. Let's consider fighter jets as one example. F-35 has been on the sell for the past couple of years as if it was, like sugar or candy. Even though we have some European fighters in place, and there are plans for the, well, not the fifth, but the sixth generation of European fighters. But the question is what is going to happen in Europe in between the fourth generation currently existing and the sixth generation in plan fighters. And that's the F-35 that provides the answer, and that's why it's selling so well. After all these problems, what does the European Defense Industrial Strategy offer? Well, many initiatives. The important part is that this should cover from the first step, from research to development to production and joint acquisition. So it shouldn't target, or these programs shouldn't target only one part of the whole process, but having an overarching framework. And this is something that the European Union has been doing very wisely in the past 2-3 years. With the minor note that better funding and more European-specific requirements will help a lot. And then with the European Defense Industrial Strategy, you can see the bottommost part. There is an opportunity to have a real joint European defense industrial production process, but it will depend mostly on member states. So it will be labeled as European, but it's still, again, in the hands of national capitals. And as for conclusion, I only wanted to show you the goals of European Defense Industrial Strategy. Well, these are ambitious goals compared to the current situation. By 2030, we want to see 35% of intra-EU defense trade, so not from external sources. We want to see 50% of EU defense procurement from the European technological and industrial base. Currently, more than 2/3 is happening from outside. And we want to see 40% of EU procurements in a collaborative manner. Currently, it stands about 11%. So this would be a gigantic leap forward. And, well, it depends, again, as I mentioned, to a large extent on the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war, also to a large extent on the outcome of the US presidential elections. But one thing is for sure, that we are going to see a lot of changes in the coming months and years. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions if you have.